Hi, welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, coming to you from Washington. And now joining us from Izmit, Turkey, is Şener Aktürk. He's a political scientist and a fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, lectures at the Department of Government, both at Harvard University. And coming from Berkeley, California, is Mujib Khan. He's affiliated with the doctoral program in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. He wrote a chapter in the book, The New Crusades, Constructing the Muslim Enemy. So Şener, in the article that you co-wrote with Mujib, you talked about the geopolitics of this anti-Muslim campaign, and I'll quote a paragraph from your article. Bigots and chauvinists, like bullies everywhere, direct their vitriol towards those seen as weak and defenseless. Because China and India have emerged with continental-scale hegemonic state and market structure in their historic domains of civilization, they are treated with great deference by Western statesmen and would-be hate-mongers like Rupert Murdoch of the News Corporation alike, a lesson Muslims would do well to ponder in the wake of campaigns of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and destruction in their historic lands. So, Şener, elaborate on that.
The key question here is the fact that there is no Muslim great power, and that opens a huge representation gap for Muslims and international organizations. If we look at United Nations Security Council, of the 5 members of UN Security Council, 4 of them are Christian majority and 1 of them is nominally Buddhist Communist China, and there is no Muslim member of the Security Council. The same is the case with the G8, the 8 most powerful wealthy nations in the world. There is not a single Muslim member in that council either. So what this leads to is that in international conflicts that concern Muslims the most, like the genocide of Bosnians, or the assault on Chechnya, or other mass killings or wars that disproportionately kill Muslims, there is no one Muslim great power to step in, bring the issue to the fore in international forum, and take decisive action to end the genocide or mass killing. That is the international level of the representation gap. When we look at domestically, the quote that you have read actually has domestic repercussions as well, because Muslims, especially in Europe, where I specialize, are also economically and politically the most disadvantaged segment of the population. That is not so much true for American Muslims, who are well educated and wealthy, but for European Muslims that is true, and who benefited. If we look at the political beneficiaries of using anti-Islamic rhetoric, it has been the right-wing conservative parties. Using Islamophobic and anti-immigrant rhetoric, right-wing took over France from Jospin and socialists, first by Jacques Chirac and now by Nicolas Sarkozy. Likewise, conservative Christian Democrats took power away from Social Democrats in Germany. Same thing in Italy. Same thing in Austria with Christian Democrats and Jörg Haider's populist party. And increasingly, this trend is spreading. And instead of a social democratic or democratic socialist Europe, we have a European political landscape that is overwhelmingly conservative and Christian Democrat. And in the US, we had, of course, a bad experience with the same phenomenon, namely the re-election of President Bush, using the rhetoric of terrorism, but actually, in many ways, a rhetoric that demonized Muslims. So the domestic and international beneficiaries of anti-Muslim propaganda that opposes as anti-terrorist propaganda have been conservatives, right-wing political parties. And the international imbalance is not going to be rectified unless we have a major reform of the United Nations and other international organizations to include at least one, if not more than one, Muslim state to represent.
Why are you calling it Muslim states? Like the issue of Europe, they're not calling themselves, we need representatives or we represent Christian states. In fact, I don't think you can find at a state level anyone else arguing that there should be a religious representation. There's a sort of hypocrisy, you can say, with Israel, which calls itself a Jewish state. So Israel perhaps gets the closest to this. But why aren't you talking about like the representation of the Arab peoples or in that way? Because the thing about the Al-Qaeda type terrorism is that they are doing it in the name of Islam. You in fact don't have another global organized, you can say, militaristic force that's doing it in the name of religion, although of course there's Christian overtones to what the Americans do and Europeans do, but it's certainly not the raison d'etre as it is with what are some of the Muslim extreme organizations. Yeah, so don't you have to deal with this? Because you keep saying there needs to be Muslim representatives. Why is it not Arab representatives if we're talking the Arab world?
It could be, but I think associating Muslims or the Muslim world with Arabs is also a mistake in many ways, because Arabs only make up 1 out of 5 Muslims in the world.
That's what I'm challenging. Why are we talking about the Muslim world? Why aren't we talking about, there's an issue of Arab representation. There may be another one of Indonesian or Bangladeshi, but why are we talking about the Muslim world? Because Mujib, you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I could sort of get into that. Muslim is often used, it's certainly directly used in a religious way, but it often has been used more in a cultural, historic, or civilizational sense as well. So one need not necessarily be particular. When you talk about Islamic art, for example, or Islamic architecture and literature and so on, it doesn't necessarily connote a purely religious meaning. It can be a broader cultural, civilizational one. And this goes back to debates over identity that have taken place, not just in the Muslim world, but in India. To what extent is India representative of a certain Hindu history, Hindu culture, Hindu civilization? That's contested, and for many people, it could be a more secular cultural or ethnic kind of sense, or it could be something like taken by certain right-wing groups in India, like the BJP, to be more of a religious nationalist one. So you have the same kinds of nuances and sort of competition between ethnic linguistic aspects of identity in the Middle East.
Yeah, because if you're going to talk about representing the Muslim world, does that mean these representatives are now going to represent the Muslims of India? I mean, from what I know, most Muslims of India consider themselves Indians.
Well, they do, but they certainly consider themselves Indians, but they also feel broader connections to other Muslim communities in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and then further afield. And so the reason why this comes up and why the point Shener was making is valid is that, as we mentioned in regards to Bosnia, European countries may not call themselves overtly Christian all the time, but there is an underlying sense of that for many. I mean, you have Christian democratic parties, and as we mentioned in terms of Bosnia, the British and French policy was actually to support Serbia during the genocide, and as Taylor Branch just made clear in his conversations with Bill Clinton, they said that what was happening was a painful, quote, a painful but necessary restoration of a Christian Europe. And so when many Muslims around the world see that, even those who are not personally necessarily religious, but have a sort of cultural sense of being Muslim, and these were very secular European Muslims who were being targeted, then this idea of needing some kind of Muslim representation that accords with their population in the world, 1.5 billion, in international forums and so on, to represent them, then comes to the fore. So I think this is why these issues are coming to the fore, and and it has to do with like Turkey's membership in Europe as well. I think it's clear that if Turkey was a largely Christian, secular or not country, it is officially secular country, it would have been a member of the European Union a long time ago. And the fact that it's not, and the fact that Bosnia, for example, what happened there in terms of the indifference or even complicity to the genocide that took place, points to the fact that these kinds of identities we're dealing with are still with us. And I would point out American support for Israel. Even though we are such a diverse country racially and religiously, the American elite has expressed a great deal of religious and cultural and ethnic solidarity with Israel vis-a-vis the Arabs, based on perceptions of those historic times.
But a lot has to do with the geopolitics of it. The issue in the Middle East for the last 100 and more years has been to stop the emergence of an Arab people with a kind of political entity that would take on the kind of size an India or China might, given the size of the population, the tremendous oil wealth. if there became a kind of regional political entity that represented the Arab peoples, that would be a major threat to certainly the traditional Western role and domination in the Middle East. But that's why I'm getting at this issue by referencing this all as a Muslim issue, it kind of obscures the real geopolitics at play here.
Right. I mean, there's
Here, let Shanir get in on this for a sec. Go ahead, Shanir.
But the problem actually goes beyond the illegitimacy, if we may say, of Middle Eastern partition, because if we go back, Middle East acquired the borders that it now has in 1918, the settlement of the First World War, and the results of the First World War and the partition of the Middle East into Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Kuwait, and whatnot hasn't occurred because of some kind of popular movement to create these states. So even the division between Turkey and the Arab world is a result of colonial politics and the way decolonization occurred in the Middle East, as it did also in much of sub-Saharan Africa. So if the geopolitics question is about challenging colonial borders, that would challenge not only the borders between Arab states, but also between Arab states and many non-Arab states in the Middle East and in Africa as well. That's where many plans for unification in Africa and in the Middle East hit the wall in terms of international politics. And I think that that relates to your question about preventing the emergence of a great power in the Middle East or South Asia, for that matter, or in Africa.
In the next segment of our interview, let's talk about why all this should matter to an ordinary American. Please join us for the next segment of our interview on the Real News Network.